Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 14th of December, where we are nearing the ending of the semester. Last class, there was actually a snow day, though I had intended for us to spend last class either working on paper number 2 or finishing the viewing of The Exorcist, so things worked out quite nicely. According to our syllabus, the journal for The Exorcist is due today, though I can take that journal up until the 19th, which is Monday, because of the snow day and also because we were a little bit behind as well. So at any point between now and Monday, you can hand in that exorcist journal, where our last class on Monday will result in our finishing up with some quotes from The Exorcist and talking a little bit about Stephen King and his short stories. Note that there isn't a journal assigned for Stephen King. The Exorcist is your last journal. And your final exam is scheduled for Wednesday, December 21st at 8 a.m. That's a time chosen by the college if we had been meeting in person. So, what I will be doing is posting that on our Moodle site on the 21st at 8 a.m., and you'll have 24 hours to complete that examination. If you were taking the exam in class, you would have approximately 2 hours, which is about the length of time that you should devote to the exam. I don't expect you to spend 24 hours working on this examination. And I know that this exam won't be as neat or polished as anything that you would do over a course of days or weeks, and it's not supposed to. It's an essay exam where basically you can synthesize what we've talked about over the course of the semester. I'm going to give you a series of essay questions and ask you to choose two. It will be open book, open notes, so you can utilize things like journals and class discussion forum responses. I've fallen a little bit behind with the class discussion forum responses, but I will be catching up this weekend. Also, the 21st is when your second paper is due. The idea is that your second paper would be due at 8 a.m. or by 8 a.m. on the 21st so that you could devote all of the 21st without any kind of distraction to the final examination, which again would be due 24 hours after it's posted. So it would be due on the 22nd at 8 a.m. So, what we are doing is talking about The Exorcist. I should have returned your journal to you for The Haunting. So, if you didn't return, or for The Haunting of Hill House. So, if you didn't receive a journal, please let me know. And the background of The Exorcist is that it's very loosely based on documented exorcisms. And exorcisms go all the way back to documentation within the Bible. Specifically, there was a story of a young boy who was possessed, and William Peter Blatty made the decision to change that to a young girl. I think that's quite important when we think about the possibility of poltergeist activity, something that we had talked about in The Haunting of Hill House as well. And that while poltergeist activity is a possibility for boys, that it seems to be a phenomenon that's most often associated with female. It also leads to the shock factor. As shocking as it would be for a young boy to be experiencing these episodes, it's even more shocking for a girl, especially during the time in which this movie was made and the time in which this text came out in the 1970s. And the film obviously is a violation of multiple taboos. It earned, I believe I told you, an X rating in Boston. And I had indicated when you were watching when you could stop watching the film if you didn't want to see some of the graphic episodes. The film version I found is the extended director's cut. I wasn't able to find the free version that, online that is, that would have been originally shown in the theaters, which was about 15 minutes shorter. Some scenes were deleted because of length. Other scenes were deleted because they were seemingly too disturbing. So if you did see the movie, then you probably are familiar with the spider walk scene. And that would be when Chris McNeil was told that Burke Dennings had been killed. And then immediately after that, we see Reagan going backwards, crawling backwards, basically, downstairs with blood coming out of her mouth. That scene was deleted. In my opinion, while that scene is disturbing, there are many other scenes in the movie that are even more disturbing that remained, but nevertheless. And there also was a scene about Damien and Kara, or Damien and Marin talking a little bit about the purpose of possession that originally was deleted again because of length, and the writer William Peter Blatty, who worked closely with the director on the film, felt that it was obvious and it didn't need to be stated. But I think it is an important scene. Certainly, it's important within the text itself that the real purpose of possession is not to torment the possessed, but to torment those individuals around the possessed, which I think is really the way to think about this particular text, is focusing on the title, The Exorcist, and of course the fallout to all of the other individuals in Regan MacNeil's life. But definitely this story is about Damien Karras and his loss of faith, and it's also about Father Merrin. And the film, again, would have condensed some things, but when we think about the themes, I think those remain intact in both the film and the text. That the hero is definitely Christianity. It's something that we have seen throughout the course of the semester and many of the Gothic texts that we've read. Chris, notice how it sounds almost like Christ, but without the T. You remember, she is an atheist. You know, she's removed herself from religion. Her inner demons, and I would say this is very much a text about inner demons, much like The Haunting is about being haunted by one's past, as I suggested with Ellie. Her inner demons of guilt, because she is divorced and not devoting time to her family and her daughter. Again, think about the time period. And also the demons of privilege. She obviously lives an incredibly wealthy lifestyle. Think about that in contrast to something like Father Karras's mother, who's living in what seems to be abject poverty, and how both of those can exist side by side. If you think about what Chris does for a living, she's an actor. She lies for a living is basically what actors do. She happens to live near a church in Washington, D.C. She is an atheist, as I had indicated. She's divorced, as I indicated, and there's a Ouija board in her home. In other words, all of that opens up the possibilities of a possession occurring within her household. Dennings, too, is tortured by his own inner demons, I would argue alcohol. And think about just the 1970s and how, as a society, it was tortured. It was the scene of campus protests, and in fact, we even see embedded within The Exorcist that Chris is filming a scene about campus protests. Very meta there. It was a society that was grappling with some rampant drug use, with conflicts about Vietnam, and youth in particular were seen as monstrosities, in part because they acted like they were possessed, if you will, when they were under the influence of certain mind-altering drugs. And there was a sense that the world was going to hell, so we may as well give us a story in which hell actually comes to the world. If you are familiar with Rosemary's Baby, that was another text and movie that came out in the late 1960s that also talked about the idea of the devil basically being on earth. Lots of symbolism of doors in both the text and the film. This is an entryway, whether it's an entryway into another dimension or an entryway into the psyche. And we see the usual ambiguity that we've seen in Gothic texts. This time we have an additional element that we didn't necessarily have in The Haunting of Hill House, the possibility of physiological issues. The Exorcist talks a great deal about some of the medical possibilities. Before we go to the psychological, which is something that we talked about with Ellie, how unreliable she is as a narrator, so we can't trust her perceptions, or that means the events that occur. But the idea that Regan could either be suffering from some sort of physical ailment or from some sort of psychological ailment. Or, of course, there's always the idea of the paranormal. We talked about, excuse me, the idea of the poltergeist. And the supernatural, that which defies the natural order. We're introduced to a demon, Pazuzu, who happens to be the demon of disease. One might say that this text is a commentary about the disease that is basically corrupting American society in the 1970s. And one of the discussion forum questions was, why is this text set in Iraq. From a biblical perspective, Iraq is reputedly the seat of the Garden of Evil, or the Garden of Eden, where ultimately evil came and destroyed humanity, Adam and Eve specifically, through the temptation of the apple and their descent accordingly. And that's why, in theory, there's never supposed to be peace in the Middle East. So setting it in that locale gives us that biblical reference, that biblical frame, which is so important for this particular text. The interesting, or one of the interesting things, is that this was the first horror film to be nominated for Academy Awards. Best Picture actually had 10 picture nominations. It won for sound and best adapted screenplay. I think I had indicated to you that they utilized a good number of subliminal techniques, both through visual and audio, in order to disorient, disturb the viewer. If you saw the film, you would have noticed that they play with volume, for instance, quite frequently, going down to almost silence at some points, and then a huge explosion of sound. Many of the scenes of the possession were actually layered with sounds of pigs being slaughtered. So again, all of that is meant to disorient the viewer. The reviews calling this a supernatural mystery story, I think it's also applicable to something like The Haunting of Hill House, but it's certainly more so when we get to The Exorcist. Kinderman, who is a kind man or a kinder man. If you were familiar with the television show from the 1970s called Columbo, about a bumbling detective who really used that as a ruse in order to be able to determine the truth of the mystery and be able to capture the criminal. Kinderman is in some ways modeled after that seemingly kind, innocuous individual who ultimately is much more clever than would appear underneath the surface. So the book opens with some quotations about biblical evil and connecting that with human evil. I'll be quoting some of those next class. And the idea that we have a long history of evil and the battle against good and evil that began perhaps in Iraq itself. So again, reputedly, that was the fall of man in Iraq, and Father Merrin has a premonition. And Merrin is an interesting character. In some ways, he might remind you of Van Helsing, that he's a man who can merge science. He's an archaeologist in this instance, and religion. He's a Jesuit priest, which means he's from the Society of Jesus. We talked a little bit about this in terms of Dr. Montague as well in The Haunting of Hill House. The ability to merge science and also the ability to merge either spirituality or belief in the supernatural. And we're introduced initially with a curd with rotting teeth. And one of the things Merrin talks about is the sense of how do you love the base and the bestial, the diseased, if you will. Again, I think that's why it's important that Pazuzu happens to be presented to us as a demon of disease and sickness from the Southwest, because society itself could be seen as being corrupted by disease and sickness. We see a sunset. Of course, this represents the idea of descent when we watch the film initially. And in the first book, we're told about how the house, and this is in Washington, D.C., and might I suggest, if Iraq was the first seat of evil, perhaps Washington, D.C. is our contemporary seat of evil. The house was gripped by ivy. I like that term about the idea of the claustrophobia of gripping. It also occurred on April 1st, the story. There's a sense of humor here, that the devil does have a kind of a dark sense of humor. And we talked a little bit about the generation gap in our own time, but certainly that was something that was discussed in this text as well. Chris, again, who's presented as older, an atheist, she's divorced, a wealthy actor. Sharon, younger and spending her time with transcendental meditation. Perhaps another reason why this home, it leads itself to being open to the possibility of evil. And Dennings and his incredible use of profanity leads to the question of, could Regan have basically mimicked much of Dennings' speech patterns when she's under the guise of, or when she's under possession? Was that just a guise for her to express her psychological torment, or was this a real possession? Which will lead us to our attendance question that I'll get to in a moment. She's 11 years old, and 12 is so important in terms of the idea of poltergeist activity. Again, that cusp of adolescence and womanhood. She's having problems with math problems. They're missing clothes. There's moved furniture. And the Ouija board that she uses to communicate with Captain Howdy. Howdy could be Howard for the name of her father. But that said, these can also be elements associated with poltergeist or even supernatural activity. Karras was a boxer in his former life before he became a priest, and might I suggest that he is going to be fighting the fight of his life when he fights against the devil. And he has lost his faith. He's looking for a sign, and one might say that this is the biggest sign of all that he finds. And he encounters on his way to going to his poverty-stricken mother a derelict who basically is begging, and he's struggling. That's Karras. Well, how do you love the beast? And that's I think the major element within this text is that how do you retain love and concern for the base, whether it's the cur with the rotting teeth, the drunk derelict, or the possessed girl, if you will. Karras ends up giving him money for a cab, or gives him money that Karras had saved for a cab. This shows how Karras is willing to offer sacrifice, almost like a Jesus figure. And we'll see this later on as the text continues. And Karras's mom, we're introduced to her, this lonely poor woman in the Bronx, that ultimately this was the consequence of Karras choosing a life of God, that he needed to abandon his own family. And we see how different it is for Chris MacNeil, who lives in such luxury and lives in such comfort. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the day after Regan's birthday. So now she's 12. And we see all kinds of personality changes where she's lying. There's insomnia. And of course, questions about, is this physiological? Is it psychological? Is it supernatural? Perhaps all three are possible, as I had suggested with the haunting as well. There's nothing to negate the idea that Ellie is disturbed and untrustworthy and the house is haunted at the same time. Chapter 4, we're given some background information, much like in The Haunting, giving us background information about Ouija boards and hauntings, much like in Dracula, giving background information about vampires. Here, we get background information about the Black Mass and church desecrations, and we see how Karras's mother ends up dying alone, which just racks him with guilt, something that the demon figure is going to be able to utilize to its benefit. We're introduced to a character named Mrs. Perrin that we don't see in the film. This is someone that Regan won't talk to and won't shake hands with. Supposedly she's a psychic. So this leads to some further possibility that these are events that are influenced by supernatural entities, because how would Regan know that this would be somebody that she should be avoiding? And Mrs. Perrin also gives us some background information about the occult and about seances. Again, that's going to be important if we don't necessarily know about this prior to reading the text. We see how Regan loses control of bodily functions, and this is always a fear in the Gothic about the loss of control. In book 2, we're introduced to an opening quote about how you can achieve wisdom through the awful grace of God, that the grace of God can oftentimes be awful. And if this is indeed God trying to give Father Karras a sign, this is perhaps an awful way to go about doing it. We know that we're told about the loneliness that priests experience. We're told a little bit about Regan's deterioration, her vulgarity. The book on devil worship disappears. At some point, Karras's mother, before her death, is taken to an insane asylum. We know that ultimately this theme of sanity and insanity is something that runs through the Gothic. We're told that Regan is perhaps speaking in other tongues, which is a piece of evidence for possession, but she's speaking backwards. We see her body contortions, her animal noises, illustrating the bestial, the hypersexuality, again, very shocking for this audience in this time period. And Burke is killed, and again, that leads us to the murder mystery of who killed Burke, and how did that happen? And was Regan responsible for that, or was it merely just a drunken episode? Or could both have been some possibility? And a hypnotized Regan says through the demon's voice that they hate Regan and they want to punish her. Again, the question might be why. The homicide detective Kinderman, who's kind, has a lengthy speech about youth and LSD and the use of drugs. Again, that's a subtext, especially when we talk about Carl Engstrom, who isn't given much movie time. He's given a little bit more of a plot in the film. He happens to be one of the servants for Chris MacNeil. And it turns out that he's an ex-felon because he was trying to provide drugs to his drug-addicted daughter, something that he's been keeping a secret from his wife. And again, he is tormented by his own inner demons, Carl Engstrom, about the situation that his daughter is in. At one point, Chris is no longer able to act because the family situation has become so dire. She loses a movie role in a movie called Hope. That's not too thinly veiled reference to the idea that she too is losing her hope, literally and figuratively. Kinderman consults with Karras about those church desecrations, and we learn about the symptoms of possession much through that book that Mrs. Perrin had offered. The book goes missing, and then it's found under Regan's bed. And the question is, could Regan have taken the book and read the book? And ultimately, this is more psychological rather than supernatural. We don't necessarily know for certain, and that's one of the markers of Gothic literature, is that outside of Lovecraft, just about every author provides us with the possibility of ambiguity. In book 3 is where we get some opening quotes about biblical signs, and this is where Chris is begging Father Karras for an exorcism, where Regan is a thing and a sense of the other who happens to be possessed by the devil. The other is something that we've examined throughout the entire semester. The demon knows that Karras's mother is dead, but he won't reveal the maiden name. Whether that's because we don't have a demon and we have just Regan, who basically is using bits and pieces of perhaps eavesdropped information that she has, or whether this is a demon that's tormenting and torturing, because of course the best way to torment and torture Father Karras would be to not provide him with definitive proof of a supernatural event. Some of you had even suggested something similar in The Haunting with Mrs. Montague, that the best way to haunt her, so to speak, would be to not provide her with evidence of hauntings. So both Chris and Father Karras are in pain. They're both haunted by their demons. Karras's faith begins to return at this point, thinking that perhaps this is a sign from God and not just poltergeist phenomenon. Even the demon at one point tells Karras, we must give you a reason to doubt. Holy water incident where Karras supposedly puts holy water on Regan and she reacts violently, but it turns out it's not holy water, it's tap water. Again, the distinction would be that holy water is blessed, something that's explained to us in the text if we didn't understand the distinction between the two. And is this proof that this is not a real supernatural entity? Or is this proof that this is a supernatural entity that is determined to torture and torment through uncertainty? And we find out about Carl Engstrom's drug addict daughter. This, quote, embarrassment over the holy water is what the demon says when they have further conversations later on in the novel, suggesting that the demon deliberately did this in order to cast doubt. Their words on Regan MacNeil's skin help me, for instance. It almost reminds me of the words on the wall in The Haunting with Ellie. And Karras asks for permission for exorcism, even though there's some ambiguity associated with her possession. But his faith is increasing. And what we do see is that when Marin, who basically is working on a book, is consulted with it about this, he already knows. So the sense of this premonition, which again leads credence to the idea that these are supernatural events. We don't get much of Marin's story in the film. We get more of it in the text when he's accused by the demon, because the demon attacks through a psychological elements, and accusing Marin of basically hiding from his duties of taking care of the poor and the infirm by writing books and living in a world of academia. And certainly we can see even Damien Karras, who by the standards of the priesthood is living rather simply. We could see that in the film when we saw all the pomp and circumstance of some of the church hierarchy. Karras is still living a very comfortable and privileged life compared to the life that his mother had to live. So in book 4 is where we get an opening quote about love and the power of love. And this is where we finally are going to get the climax, where we learn about the origins of Damien Karras' name. That Damien was a priest who was devoted to caring for lepers, and he caught the disease himself. A little bit of foreshadowing there is what happens with Damien Karras himself during the exorcism, where it seems that he himself becomes possessed, and then he sacrifices himself, this time not with his cab money, but by committing suicide in order to kill the demon. Though, of course, the ambiguity could be that this wasn't necessarily a real supernatural episode, but he had a psychotic break and basically believed that he was possessed. I would like the supernatural explanation, because that's really been the bedrock of this entire semester. So when we think about something like Jekyll and Hyde, I can't help but think about salts and the corrupted salts, and how that would be so important to Jekyll's transformation into Hyde, which he's not able to duplicate because he can no longer find that corrupted salt. So the demon attacks Marin's pride, how he's escaped his inferiors in archaeology, attacks the servants, such as the Engstroms, about their drug-addicted daughter, attacks Sharon, who it turns out, and again, we don't get much of her story in the film, but it turns out that she is sexually attracted to Father Karras. Chris putting her family before her, or putting her career before her family, and Karras, and of course the guilt he has about his mother's death. Lots of biblical references of possession. And then on page 351 of the edition that I had assigned, and I'll talk a little bit more about this next class, the purpose of possession is not to torment the possessed, but the purpose of possession is for tormenting the observers, so that they fall into despair about the bestial, the vile, the unworthy, the ugly, and the inhuman. And when we view it from that perspective, it seems to make a lot of sense as to why someone like Regan MacNeil would have been chosen, because it could torment initially Father Karras and also bring Father Marin, but it would also have the ability to torment individuals such as Chris MacNeil. So the belief in God, at least the way it's presented in this text, is the accepting of possibility that God could love us despite the bestial, despite the evil that exists. So, and Marin talks a little bit more about this, about he was once repelled by certain people, and he despaired he couldn't love them, and that meant that he lost his faith. And then he realized that it wasn't about a feeling, it was about an action, that we should act with love, not necessarily feel love in our daily lives. One of the lessons of this text. And he connects that to friends and lovers as well, and saying that sometimes you don't necessarily feel love, but you should always act with love. And that's very human. Eventually, Marin dies of a heart attack, and Karras sacrifices himself by telling the demon, "Take me," and then he jumps out of the window, much like the death that we saw with Burke Dennings. Notice that the pedestrians basically ignore Karras. They think that he's some sort of a drunk, which goes to show again the disease that basically is corrupting America and perhaps the world, that we aren't acting with love. And Damien gives his last confession where his eyes are filled with joy and peace. So one assumes that that's evidence that he's entered into the afterlife and that he's gotten what he most wanted, was the ability to see God. We do get an epilogue. It happens in late June. So we know that June and July and August is when we move from the spring into the summer, which is the height of life, renewal, rebirth. Though, of course, for Ellie, it was a little bit different, but it was set during a pagan day that could be associated with negative rather than just positive. Chris, at this point, remember, the atheist says she does believe in the devil because he, according to her, keeps advertising, though not necessarily believing in God in this point. And then what we see, and this was cut from the original film, but it was added into the extended version, that Kinderman and Father Dyer begin to form a relationship. In some ways, it's very similar to the relationship that Kinderman had with Damien Karras. And the idea is that they could honor Karras by having a relationship of their own. So those were some of the major points that I wanted to focus on with The Exorcist. As I said, I have some more to discuss next class, as well as putting some closure onto things with talking about Stephen King. Our attendance question, which will be due on Thursday, which will be due on Wednesday. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is when it's going to be due. It's hard to keep track at this point of the semester. At 8 a.m. Do you think that Reagan was possessed? And why or why not? So the attendance question again, which would be due on Friday, because if you are watching this video then on Wednesday, then that would be 48 hours from now. Do you think Reagan was possessed? Why or why not? And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses. And again, I'll be using this weekend to catch up with my responses to the discussion forum questions. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I will see you next week for one last class in Gothic literature before our final. Take care. Bye-bye.